Hi everybody, I'm Jack, the Rambling Raconteur, and this week I've continued reading the poetry and prose of Christina Rossetti. This Oxford World Classics volume is a great one. It has her major poetry, and then it also includes some short stories she wrote that don't necessarily feel like short stories, but are, sort of in the sense that Gerard de Nerval wrote short stories. And then it has her prose, some letters, some different essay-ish type things, but it also has her devotional prose, which is really interesting, particularly with some of her major poetry. I regard Christina Rossetti as a fantastic poet, a very strong poet with an interesting sensibility that harks back to some of those high romantic ideas, but also is very much like concerned with what is happening with mid and late Victorian society. How is that changing? How is that changing for all of the people, but how is it changing for women? How is it changing the way we interact spiritually with each other? And so the poem I want to talk about is Goblin Market. I think it's often regarded as her most famous poem. I wasn't exposed to it in high school, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was printed in like a high school anthology, like a literature anthology. But it's interesting in that the major influences on it seem to have been The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, and that massive allegory. And she's very careful in saying that Goblin Market is not meant to necessarily to be this massive allegory the way Pilgrim's Progress was. But that's a huge influence. But then the Bible, honestly, is the other massive influence on this work. And it's very strange, it's very disturbing. The goblins were shown are frankly terrifying the way they're described. And they're, even at the beginning, when they're just merchants, they're described in a way that's almost terrifying. So I'm going to read a couple of passages as I discuss it. But this is, again, Goblin Market. I'll try to find like a free like PDF link or something and throw it in the description below. Morning and evening, maids heard the goblins cry, "Come buy our orchard fruits, come buy, come buy." And then it lists this whole set of what they have, and it's all these different types of fruit. And there are two sisters, Lizzie and Laura, and they sort of both can hear the goblins crying, and that becomes important later on. They both can hear that the goblins are trying to sell these wares. And so then we get down, and down the glen tramp little men. One hauls a basket, one bears a plate, one lugs a golden dish of many pounds weight. And it goes through, one had a cat's face, one whisked a tail, one tramped at a rat's pace, one crawled like a snail, one like a wombat, prowled obtuse and furry, one like a rattle, tumbled hurry-scurry. She heard a voice like voice of doves, cooing all together. They sounded kind and full of loves in the pleasant weather. And so we're given all of these animals that the goblins resemble, and they're cooing like doves. But there's also this sense of the goblins are animalistic in a sense. They are not humans. They're not necessarily going to value humans the way that we might expect another character to. And that there is this sense of lurking danger that's there. And so they offer their fruits, their wares, and Lizzie, of course, is like, absolutely not. Like, we have to get away. And one of the currents that runs through this is this question of, was Christina Rossetti trying to build this like economic allegory? I don't find that interpretation to work. There does perhaps seem to be a sexual undercurrent to it, which fits some of those Victorian stereotypes that have come down. But I think it's a little bit different than we might expect. So, but sweet-toothed Laura spoke in haste. "Good folk, I have no coin. To take were too purloin. I have no copper in my purse. I have no silver either. And all my gold is on the furze that shakes in windy weather, above the rusty heather." "You have much gold upon your head," they answered all together. "Buy from us with a golden curl." She clipped a precious golden lock. She dropped a tear more rare than pearl. Then sucked their fruit globes fair or red, sweeter than honey from the rock, stronger than man rejoicing wine, clearer than water flowed that juice. She never tasted such before. How should it cloy with length of use? She sucked and sucked and sucked the more, fruits which that unknown orchard bore. She sucked until her lips were sore, then flung the emptied rinds away, but gathered up one kernel stone, and knew not was it night or day. as she turned home alone. And there seems to be this obvious sense, and there's a later line where it talks about the joys that brides would have. There seems to be this sense of like by cutting the lock of hair, that she's giving herself to the goblins. She's not purchasing the fruits from the goblins, but in taking the fruit from them and taking the fruit from the goblins, which we're going to see is essentially like the earth or evil matters, worldly matters, and taking that, she can't just buy that. She actually has to give herself. And I think there's this deep interpretation around, okay, it's a sexual form of possession and transaction. But I'm not sure that that's what Rossetti's actually pushing towards. If we think of the idea of golden hair, like the gold above one's head, with the way Rossetti thinks, I don't think it's actually necessarily limited to that. I think it's actually more the idea of like she's casting her halo down. Like she's losing the golden halo she would have on her head and giving that to the goblins when she takes their worldly fruit. She's not giving herself and becoming like defiled in some way by doing that in a sexual way. It's a more spiritual defilement where she loses her golden halo. So that's my interpretation. That's the Jack interpretation. But then just real quickly, the honey from the rock is very much an allusion to the Old Testament and the Promised Land and the Israelites wandering. And then the gathered back kernel stone to me resembles Persephone in Hades, or I had just read Ovid last month, and then that idea of like she went to, when Hades kidnapped Persephone and took her down to hell, Hades, she had the pomegranate seed, and that was why she ended up having to stay, for a season each year. So Laura tries the fruit and goes back up, but and she finds Lizzie, and Lizzie's like, that's dangerous, but there doesn't seem, Laura still sleeps that night perfectly fine. And it isn't until the next day that she realizes something's wrong, which is they go back out, and suddenly Lizzie, who didn't buy the fruit yesterday, hears the goblin men, the merchants again, singing their song, trying to get, customers. And Laura can't hear them. And she wants that fruit that tasted so good yesterday, but she's terrified. Laura turned cold as stone to find her sister heard that cry alone, that goblin cry, come buy our fruits, come buy. Must she then buy no more such dainty fruit? Must she no more that succulous pasture find? Gone deaf and blind, her tree of life dropped from the root. And this goes on day after day. Lizzie hears the goblins. Laura, who has sampled their fruit and desires it so greatly, can't find it. And so Lizzie eventually, to rescue her sister from this melancholy, from this depression, from all of this overwhelming sense of absence, is willing to go buy the fruit. She won't give her hair. They ask for her hair and she says, absolutely not. Here's some coin. I will only give you this coin. And so the goblins become enraged and they flat out assault her. They're beating her, they're attacking her. And it's a fairly troublesome, 2 pages to read. Initially, they're very rude. They say rude things. And then one may lead a horse to water, 20 cannot make him drink. Though the goblins cuffed and caught her, coaxed and fought her, bullied and besought her, scratched her, pinched her, black as ink, kicked and knocked her, mauled and mocked her, Lizzie uttered not a word, would not open lip from lip, lest they should cram a mouthful in, but laughed in heart to feel the drip of juice that syruped all her face, and lodged in dimples of her chin, and streaked her neck, which quaked like curd. And so they eventually give up, but you see this sense of violence that underlies the interaction. It is not just about purchasing this fruit. It is a very, these goblins are evil. They are hateful, they are loathsome, and that cooing of doves that we heard at the beginning, they have become like feral in the way they attack her, and the way that the juice is described is like resting everywhere she has like a crevice on her face now. The fruit has been like mashed against it. She's been hit. And so she gets her coin back because they won't sell her the fruit, and Lizzie returns with her coin, with her hair, with, in my sense, that halo, back to her sister Laura. And this is where it gets really strange. So Lizzie says, I've basically allowed them to do this so that you can have all this fruit syrup, that's on me. Like, if you want to taste the fruit, you can come get it. Like, this bruise I've got here, there's some right here. And so Laura does that. She goes and she desires that fruit so much that she goes and is like kissing her sister's bruises, getting the fruit juice and the syrup, off of her sister. And it is not sexual at all. It is completely not sexual. But it's weird and Laura's overwhelmed with gratitude for Lizzie, but she doesn't feel bad that Lizzie did all this. I don't get the sense necessarily that she does all this. She's honestly most worried, like, Lizzie, did you taste the fruit? Not like, wow, you did all this for me. It's such a strange scene. And so as Laura tastes the fruit, here's what happens. Her lips begin to scorch. That juice was wormwood to her tongue. She loathed the feast. Writhing as one possessed, she leaped and sung, rent all her robe and wrung, her hands in lamentable haste, and beat her breast. Her locks streamed like the torch, borne by a racer at full speed. Moving on, swift fire spread through her veins, knocked at her heart, met the fire smoldering there, and overbore its lesser flame. She gorged on bitterness without a name. Ah, fool to choose such part of soul-consuming care, sense failed in the mortal strife, like the watchtower of a town which an earthquake shatters down. And so we get this sense that, and Laura basically passes out from the agony of it. So in tasting it a second time, it basically like completely overwhelms her body. It in a sense overwhelms her soul, and she's like unconscious from the pain, that like the fires that burn through her body. And Lizzie, we don't get any sense that she's in pain at all, even though we know she was absolutely assaulted and mauled and beaten. There's no real description of her pain. She ends up nursing Laura back to health. And that to me is what makes this such a strange, like I think it's more about a spiritual warfare rather than violence towards women, or like some type of Victorian sexual politics that's at play in this work. And I might be totally wrong on that, but I really think that the emphasis Rossetti's making is on this idea of when we are willing to have these types of interactions for worldly goods, we are harmed spiritually, not just. And the idea, the part of that I want to continue is that Lizzie was attacked physically and beaten physically, but there's no sense of like that pain or needing to recover from that. It's as if it just drops off and passes off almost immediately. Whereas Laura receives a spiritual wound, spiritual pain, and that takes a long time to recover, of Lizzie nursing her back. And then it ends with, they both do end up getting married. They have their own daughters. Their daughters are friends. And Laura just kind of casually says to her daughters, like, you need to love each other as sisters. You are each other's truest friends. You're the ones that will need to rely on each other. And so it doesn't have this moral of, somebody made a mistake and it ruined her life the entire way, which I think is nice. It's one of the reasons I like Goblin Market. I've returned to it over the past 12 years, I think, since I first encountered it a number of times. But one of the things that I think is really weird and really interesting is Rossetti makes some explicit allusions to Revelation 17 and 18, where a woman is presented who's called the Whore of Babylon in Revelation, and and represents this idea of like worldly wealth. And then when the woman is cast down, all of these merchants cry and they weep. And that's sort of this sense of the goblins as merchants, Laura as the woman. And Rossetti makes these parallels. What's really cool about this volume is in the devotional prose, we have Rossetti's commentary on Revelation 17 and 18. The woman is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. Without controversy, what then is she? She seems to include or invite all which tempts man at his earthly proudest and mightiest. Ambition shedding blood as water, with garments rolled in blood scarlet as her array. Enervating luxury, as she herself sits inert on her scarlet breast. sensual excess, foul is her cup, license that is not liberty, but is chains and fetters, like her bravery of gold and pearls and precious stones. Woe to her dupes! Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and strengthened himself in his wickedness. Such as this, then, is she. From all this, and from whatsoever beside she may be, may we, every one of us, great or small, be delivered. Amen. And then jumping into Revelation chapter 18, again Rossetti's commentary, those kings did at last bewail Babylon for herself. These merchants bewail her because of their own impoverishment. They all alike are of the earth, yet is there a finer and a coarser clay. Only I must beware of reckoning that sympathy with evil in itself is nobler than sympathy with evil in its effects. Neither is nobler. One may be baser. From both, O Lord, deliver us. And so we see this sense of Rossetti feels this intense compassion and wants to make sure that she's never like forced into these situations, but also that others aren't. And that's a really fascinating aspect. I think when we see Laura and what happens to Laura and what happens to Lizzie, but specifically what happens to Laura, who tastes the fruit and then is ultimately redeemed, we see this sense of Rossetti saying like it's okay to love another person so much that you would be willing to kind of like put yourself through some form of hell in order to help redeem their life, make it better. And that's always a hard message to experience in literature, but it's always interesting to see the people who do explore that and how they explore it. So that's Goblin Market from Christina Rossetti. Tremendous poem. I highly recommend it. I highly recommend really all of her work. It's fascinating. I think she exemplifies this interesting period where you have these Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood painters who aren't necessarily great poets or writers, but John William Waterhouse's paintings are tremendous and fantastic and just filled with color. It's like Technicolor on a painting. But she's like spending time with all these people and then going and writing poetry that is just absolutely fascinating, that just, cuts like a knife to the heart. So that's Christina Rossetti. If you've ever or never read Possession by AS Byatt from the 1980s, the female, it involves a dual timeline. Like there's a pair of literary researchers in the 1980s, and then there's a pair of Victorian poets. The female Victorian poet is very much a stalking horse for Christina Rossetti. So if you've ever read this, you might try her poetry. If you've ever read her poetry, you might enjoy this novel. The other poet in the book is kind of based on Robert Browning, much more so than Tennyson. So if you like Robert Browning's poetry, take a look. And I guess the other one that's weird is sort of a Pre-Raphaelite sensibility in terms of music is the singer Lorena McKinnon, who sometimes takes like flat out passages from Shakespeare or Tennyson or something and puts it to music and sings it. So I may link one of her songs in the description box below as well. But I don't know. Maybe you totally disagree with my interpretation, or you think that I should have gone and read Paradise Lost. Well, that's okay. I hope everybody's safe and well. Thank you.